Welcome to the API Academy video series. In this video, we take a look at the challenges of API design and the best practices to overcome them. Why is API design difficult? APIs are the building blocks that enable developers to create complex applications. When designing an API, you have a lot of decisions to make, things like architectural style, message formats, along with other smaller decisions like error formats, message patterns, status codes, and so on. With so many decisions to make and so many differing opinions available on interface design, it's easy to feel frustrated by the process. Even worse, it's possible to follow bad advice and end up designing an API that developers dislike using. This is why at the API Academy, we stress the importance of making rational decisions rather than selecting design patterns based on emotions or trends. Common challenges faced by organizations when designing their APIs include managing costs, in particular infrastructure costs. From managing multiple gateway servers and instances to building an entire API management program from the ground up, the wrong infrastructure approach can lead to unnecessary and unwieldy expenses. Scalability. To a developer, there's nothing more ironic than having a wildly successful API that can't scale to meet demand. Addressing scalability early on in the process can help define early adoption, future success, and the lifespan of the API. Scalability can be managed through a combination of load testing, authentication, throttling, quota management, and API caching. Then there is security. Security should be incorporated at the infrastructure level. You'll need a multi-pronged approach that includes leveraging an API gateway to easily validate, authorize, and control the access of legitimate API consumers, as well as protect endpoints against malicious traffic. These are all crucial considerations when designing and architecting your API. Let's also look at the direct obstacles you, the API designer, might face during the design process. Obstacle number 1. Designers project their own perspective. As the designer, you have an intimate knowledge of your product. You know how API components interact with each other, as well as the requirements and nuances that make or break inbound and outbound transactions. This internal perspective and specialized knowledge could leak out into design in a way that makes little sense or add no value to an external developer, whereas yet, it may muddle their ability to leverage your APIs. In this example, we want to support a relatively simple interaction. Find the location of an item in a warehouse. We'll find that our internal systems may bring some complexity to the situation. For example, a lot of businesses manage their inventory on a first-in, first-out basis. What if items are categorized based on the time that they arrive in the facility, and each of these categories is stored in different sections of the warehouse? Internally, we have to know when the item arrived before heading to the correct section of the warehouse to find it. But the external user is not familiar with and does not need to know the intricacies of our internal systems. A simpler interface would be one that hides this internal complexity and provides a simple API call that protects the end user from the details of the underlying systems. This can be achieved, for example, through comprehensive metadata and tagging. Obstacle number 2. Designers have biases. Designers are human. We have personalities, emotions, likes, dislikes, and judgments. It's perfectly fine for a designer's personality to be reflected in design, but we need to be careful that our decisions are not impaired as to reduce the usability of the design for our intended audience. If we were to ask which of these vehicles provides the best user experience, there is no right answer because the answer will depend on context, functionality, and/or user preference. Similarly, which of these API styles provides the best developer experience? Different people have different opinions about how to approach and handle APIs. What if the designer favors a specific API style, while the business analyst prefers another? What if the designer thinks a good product speaks for itself and needs no learning aids such as documentation? Biases such as these can negatively impact our design decision-making. Let's take an example from something we see and use every day, a keyboard. Popular convention dictates that the arrangement of characters on a QWERTY keyboard was designed to prevent jamming on mechanical typewriters of old. With the emergence of electric typewriters and computer keyboards, new keyboard designs have been invented that improves typing speed and ergonomics. The best known of these, the Dvorak keyboard, was precisely designed for this purpose. According to studies, placing the characters in this order not only improves typing speed, but also minimizes errors and reduces movement and subsequently injuries to the fingers. However, despite their more rational designs, these new keyboards have not received wide acceptance and QWERTY remains the design of choice. What does this tell us about biases? API designers should try to create interfaces from the perspective of their target developers. Even though your opinion may be the correct one, users won't care. Technical purity shouldn't always win, and users should always be consulted as part of the decision process. The next obstacle is assumptions. Similar to the bias obstacle, this issue arises from the information asymmetry between the user and the designer. The crux to this obstacle is the following. Ideally, designers want to create user-centric products. When there exists a knowledge gap, designers will make assumptions to fill in that gap. Unfortunately, these assumptions aren't always correct. The fact is, many organizations segregate the decision makers and users from the designers and teams tasked with implementation and testing. By the time the testing phase begins, the specification has gotten lost in translation and the testers aren't quite clear on the exact purpose of the API and its users. Continuing on our keyboard example, this mobile device was launched back in 2010 by a well-known company in India. Notice that the keyboard is neither QWERTY nor Dvorak, instead it's arranged in an alphabetical order. The company claims they made this phone to reach the segment of people who never used a computer or a traditional keyboard before. Incidentally, it was a third-party market research company that informed them that such consumers found QWERTY to be cumbersome. Needless to say, this was the company's first and only foray into an alphabetical keyboard. Another example is the assumption of perceived complexity of an interface. In his books, researcher Don Norman talks about the cultural differences in perceived complexity. According to Norman, while North American and European consumers tend to prefer simpler appliance interfaces with less dials, on a visit to South Korea, he found that Korean consumers prefer more complex interfaces because they indicate a level of feature richness. Last but not least, it's easy to assume incorrectly about the users of our API. It is not enough to just get rid of preconceived stereotypes and notions. We need to dig deeper into their needs, expertise, and familiarity. Our goal is to narrow down our audience to identify common characteristics that can drive the developer experience we're trying to create. For example, how would you classify the developers that you are targeting with your API? Are you targeting startup or enterprise developers? Are there specific industries you're going after? Could you categorize your end users based on age, wealth, geography, or other market segment? Maybe you're targeting specific mobile devices like iOS or Android. You could also be targeting server-based applications or even smart TVs and consoles. It is okay if other personas come along and start using our API. The key here is by focusing on a specific audience, we can really get to a great design that will feel simple, familiar, and safe to them. Here are some takeaways in overcoming the assumptions obstacle. A cardinal sin for a designer is to make assumptions about their audience without any level of validation. Don't make this mistake. Even if your assumption is proven correct, not all users have the same needs, expertise, and familiarity. Having said that, some usability factors are universal and can be fulfilled with some effort and validation. Great UX happens when we really put ourselves in our user's shoes and ultimately design for real people and real-world usage. Obstacle 4. The resource obstacle. In this familiar scenario, lack of time, budget, people, and/or skills become barriers to good design, no matter how good the intentions of the designer. What happens when designers can't afford good design? They may choose to cut corners. They follow prescriptive advice and examples with no regard to context or user. They may also overcompensate for a lack of resources by focusing on less relevant details. Ultimately, the drive to continually release new API functionality means there's rarely sufficient time to properly architect reusable tests capable of incorporating new data. Testers tend to reuse the same handful of static sample records, which fall short of accurately representing the full set of API capabilities, let alone customer-specific usage. Some best practices for overcoming resource shortage are: prioritize. Make sure what your priorities are. Does it make more sense to invest more resources into certain functionalities or a specific customer base? Assign design issues as they arise. Postponing them only magnifies the problem. Taking some shortcuts are okay, within reason of course. And when it really comes down to it, something that's less polished but usable is still more valuable than a grand design that does not meet your user's needs and requirements. You have reached the end of the video Overcoming API Design Obstacles. You should now be able to summarize some common challenges plaguing API design, including cost, scalability, and security. Identify the obstacles you may directly face during the design process, such as the perspective obstacle, the bias obstacle, assumptions obstacle, and resource shortage obstacle. And last but not least, we have also looked at ways to help avoid and overcome these design issues. Thank you for watching. We will see you in other installments of the API Academy Learning Series.